Ahoy! As a beginner in Deadlock, there are a lot of characters that you need to learn to deal with first when facing them in your games. And in this video I want to make a bit of a tier list for new players specifically. This is not a high level tier list, this is for new players as to who you need to watch out for and what potential they have early on. This is also not a recommendation on who you should play. Of course you can play the characters that I rank highly, but generally more of a this could be a problem when they're on the enemy team. I'm going to give you a quick explanation for each hero as well as to how they perform in the lane and what the main threats with them are or aren't. Our first character is Abrams. Abrams I'm going to put in a solid B tier. Now Abrams is not going to be a massive threat in lane, but he has a lot of sustain, so he's going to survive it relatively well, and once he gets a few core items online, he's going to get a lot more pressure, especially when it comes to the early team fights. He is not a late game carry, of course, so he falls out a little bit eventually, but he's a pretty serious frontline at the moment, which the game doesn't have much of, and you definitely can't ignore him. Bebop is a character where I'm a bit uncertain where I want to place him, but I'm gonna give him the S tier here. He could also go down into A tier, but he's definitely a high value character to have. Not only is the grab an excellent setup, but on lower levels of play there's also the combo potential with his abilities that will very rarely get denied. There are not going to be many players that have the right items against it and so on. So you're going to see him have a lot of damage output overall, stack his bombs relatively easily and get more damage from that. Now Bebop doesn't have the best laning of all characters. He has relative safety through his hook though, and he can secure relatively well if you right click down. This is something I learned recently from some of you guys, so thank you for that. But otherwise he will be very impactful in later stages of the game. The setup that he has with his hook for the team is just immense, and on top of that he has his ultimate, which is this massive beam that can basically clear out an entire team if they don't know what they're doing. And if you're talking about beginners, they won't know what they're doing most of the time, so you will get hit by that beam and you're not going to know what hit you and you're going to be dead before it's over. So that is going to be a massive tool in that way, but then also useful against objectives to some degree. So really, Bebop is a very, very strong pick to have in early stages. Dynamo is also very, very strong. In the right hands, absolutely an S tier character. I will say that it depends a lot on the player here more than with other characters, because it all depends on how well you place his ultimate, if you have the right items, like if you refresh your ultimate and so on. So in the right hands, definitely an S tier character, but in the wrong hands, also a B tier character. Overall, I'm going to put him into a definitely a character that on high levels of play or with more coordinated teams can have more impact in comparison. But then still a solid all-rounder anyways, and having a heal is also very helpful for new players, so you can get some more pressure out of that. The next one is going to be a bit controversial maybe, and I'm going to put two characters together here because they really do the same thing. We're going to take Great Helen and we're also going to skip ahead to Vindicta. Now both of these characters have their inherent value coming from them being able to fly. And depending on what team you're matched against, that can be a massive advantage, or it can be a minor advantage or no advantage at all. If you consider getting plucked out of the air by a Bebop, then obviously flying is not going to help you all too much and you're going to be very much a sitting duck. But in situations where the enemy team doesn't really have the tools to deal with you effectively, they counter out some characters quite nicely. Like for example, you counter out Lash to some degree because he can't use a slam on you unless you get on the ground somewhere. You counter out characters like Viscous to some degree, or you could look at, for example, Krill as well, Abrams. Anyone who's kind of ground-based cannot really deal with you all that much. Other characters, like a Wraith, for example, wouldn't really care. Against Wraith, definitely would put these down here. So it really depends more on the entire team matchup, but overall I think these do shine on lower levels of play. And they're also very popular characters along with that. Great Talon in particular, if you have someone who's coming from another MOBA who's used to ulting across lanes, it's a massive threat, but that's not going to be all that common. So with these two, I'm very flexible with their placements. Both don't have the best laning phase from the start, I would say, but definitely have not bad laning at a certain point. Once they kind of are able to apply their pressure. Great Helen, I think I'd like his laning a little bit better than Vindicta's, but I guess that's also subjective to some degree. Vindicta has some very nice combo potential if you, for example, lane with a Warden and you use that root ball, so they have their own ways of dealing with the laning phase. Haze is absolutely one of the strongest characters when it comes to low elo or low MMR beginner level of play. There's just nothing in a kit that's bad for it, basically. You have stealth, you have high gun damage, you have an ult that is somewhat AoE and that also gets you out of trouble. You can CC enemies, which also gets these two out of the sky, so again, the counter there as well. Yeah, on higher levels you need knockdown for that, I guess. This is just an extremely potent character that has so much snowball potential, and that is very hard to deal with for new players, especially because of the stealth as well. So I've very rarely seen a Haze do very poorly in the early stages of playing Deadlock, because she's just doing a bit of it all, also has good objective pressure, has decent enough laning that she can get through that, has good secure. Everything about this kid just screams, you will win your first games, you will stomp. Infernus is interesting because I think he actually has massive potential. I think he is a very strong character. I think new players kind of take a bit to pick up his kit. It's just a very aggressive kit. You kind of need to dive a lot, need to be very aggressive in your positioning overall. And that's something you're maybe not doing in your first couple of games when you're kind of just getting used to the game itself. So I think when it comes to beginners, usually their Infernus aren't that menacing yet, whereas once you get to a little bit higher levels of play, I feel like Infernus becomes more of a threat because people have picked him up more. Ivy, I was debating somewhere between A and S tier. I am going to give her S tier. I think that her kit as a whole is so strong that even though she's kind of a support character and the synergy with her ult and other characters is technically something that would require more coordinated team play, it doesn't really matter. She has such good secure in lane, she has decent pressure just from her abilities and from her gun alone, from the projectile speed. So that alone is kind of very strong in itself. And then on top of that, you get the team utility, healing allies, or like healing between you and allies, and also having the ult to carry them around. And especially if you get, for example, any AoE ulting character along with Ivy, it's going to be extremely strong. So yeah, I think Ivy definitely up there. Depending on the match, it might be an A tier or an S tier pick, but overall I would put her closer to S tier, maybe just more towards the end of S tier. Kelvin, I think, is decent. He could be extremely strong on low levels of play, on beginner levels of play, because of his beam, which does an insane amount of damage and an insane amount of poke, and that's just really, really good for early pressure. The problem is that most Kelvin players, when they initially try him out, are just not at that point where they know this, and also have utilized the rest of the kit to its fullest potential, because you kind of need to figure out how you do things with the ice gates. You know, kind of need to figure out that you can heal your allies with a grenade. And then the big problem for new players is the dome. The dome can be extremely strong and set up an entire team fight and win a team fight, but it can also mess up your own team if you place it poorly. And for new players, that will happen a lot more often because they don't really know how to use it yet and what range it has and everything. So I've seen some really good Kelvins, but I've also seen some Kelvins that were more of a detriment to the team at certain points. And as such, I'm going to put him into B tier. Lady Geist, I think, is more of a C tier character. I really like Lady Geist, don't get me wrong, but I think for new players, she's just a bit too weird, because you kind of need to get used to the fact that you're losing health when you're using your skills, and also you kind of don't really have the best early laning phase, so the bump is alright, it still costs you on health, and the health swap is something you need to get used to, and the stacking of the daggers is something that you need to get used to, or the debuff. So there's a lot of mechanics going into this character that you won't pick up the first time you play her, and it takes a while to really get decent at utilizing her full kit. And if you're not doing that, she can feel very unimpactful. She can feel very impactful too, because you can be very tanky in the middle of an enemy team that is trying to focus you down and suddenly health swap one of them if they don't know what you're doing yet. But it's very matchup dependent. She does obviously work very nicely in 1v1s, but she's also not a great objective pusher, whereas most of the top characters here have some way of putting significant pressure on objectives. So overall, I feel like she doesn't really win games, she just can perform well in a game where other people win along with her. Lash, I think, is a very strong character. I'm going to put him towards the front part of B tier here, I would say. I think, maybe behind Infernus. I think the problem with Lash is that he's just a character that you need to get used to first. Of course, his slam combo is very strong. He uses 2 into his 1, you slam on the ground, it does a lot of damage. Very straightforward. Then you can use his 3 for some extra damage, some extra heal. And that's all very guaranteed, and that's also how you can snowball. but especially his ultimate requires very good positioning, very good awareness of how things are going on one hand, if you can get away with using the ult without getting CC'd out of it, if you have the range to actually hit someone, if they will be able to go around a corner and avoid your ultimate. So there's a lot going on there, especially in the ult, that I think isn't that new player friendly, and why I haven't seen that many Lashes that performed well when I started out, whereas when you get some more games under your belt, I feel like you get a lot more Lashes that are significantly more threatening because they just have that experience. They know how to position, they know the ranges, and they basically come out of nowhere and are gone again before you know it. McGinnis is a very good character. I am going to put her in A tier here, maybe towards the front of A tier though. Could also easily be argued in S tier. It's really somewhere between that. She is just insanely good with the turns. When people don't know how to deal with the turns yet, the pressure from just her rapid fire rate and everything is very good. She's got good laning because of that. Unlike, for example, Lash, who's kind of getting bullied in lane a lot, depending on how the lane goes overall. And yeah, I think McGinnis just very solid. I also recommended her as the top beginner character. She has some weak spots which can be exposed on beginner levels of play sometimes. Like, for example, if you're playing against the Lash, there's a good chance he might just phase dive you, basically almost instantly burst down your turrets, and then you're in your ult and you can't even hit him or something. That's obviously a problem, along with a general lack of mobility of this character. But if you can get around those things, or you're just split pushing and you're kind of just ignoring the fights, she's extremely strong in that. And then she is also just a DPS character, which generally perform well for new players if you can click heads to some degree. Krill, I think, is also a solid character. Krill, once again, one of those characters where, as you learn more about them, you realize there's actually a decent level of, well, complexity, I wouldn't say, but like of playstyle variation and of methodical approaches that you can use to make this character more effective in terms of what you're building, what you're leveling. This is particularly the 2, and that can have a completely different impact, something that you may not initially see with most Krill players, which may make them appear a bit underwhelming compared to how they can perform. With that in mind, like looking at these like C, B levels here, it's a very narrow gap between them. I will point that out. Looking at Krill in comparison to Lady Geist or Abrams, there's not much that sets them apart really. Krill, for example, what's nice as a beginner here is that you get a very easy AoE heal that really helps. Paradox is the only character that I am almost tempted to put into D. I won't do it, but I don't think Paradox is useless. I just think Paradox is not very effective on beginner levels, and it's very rare that I saw a Paradox perform well when I started out, and I think that's just part of the kit. Like, Paradox win rate overall is one of the lowest, I think, at the moment, like just the statistical win rate, and the kit is relatively hard to use. You have a lot of, I would say, somewhat gimmicky stuff where you need to combo certain things that are already not that easy to combo, and then you have the always existing risk with her ultimate, where you can end up accidentally swapping into the enemy team and suddenly you're in a terrible position. So that is not something that most beginners are equipped to utilize. Laning phase is also, in my opinion, not the greatest with the burst fire and everything. That's preference, I would say, but yeah, there's a lot of other characters I'd rather be playing in lane. So Paradox, for me, currently the weakest on the roster in terms of beginner level. Once again, high emphasis on that. Pocket, I think, is a very decently performing character. I don't know if this is maybe a bit of a coincidence that we just saw a lot of strong pockets early on. Maybe since then it actually has declined a little bit. So I've seen less well-playing pockets than I used to. But I think this character has very good means to build some degree of pressure in lane at least. Very good survivability with a suitcase. And obviously that's something where you can bait enemies into kind of staying close to you and then popping the suitcase on multiple of them just because they don't know how it works yet. Also one of the characters that can very easily jungle without knowing much about it, which I think is also very handy when you're still learning other mechanics. And of course a very team fight changing ultimate, so that helps. Decent structure push as well. Not the best, obviously, but surprisingly also not the worst. So overall, I would say above average character, but also not insane S tier level. So a fair bit behind McGinnis on beginner terms. Here we have 7. 7 is going straight to the front of S tier. The best performing character overall statistically at the moment, which I think is hugely due to the beginner level performance this character has. He just has that all-denying ultimate and can not only wipe teams with that, but also build big objective pressure with that. And on beginner levels, very few people know how to counter him, so he just gets a lot of free kills, and eventually the mechanics teach people to buy actives against him or to hide behind walls and learn to deal with not running into that area for a bit. But those things take time, and if you look around and see what character people are complaining most about, it's almost always among the beginner players, which definitely is something that settles down if you go to higher levels of play. Shiv, I would say, is very, very good, can often be an S tier character, but different from, say, for example, Haze. I think he's a little bit worse at, for example, pressuring objectives by himself. He's very good at just getting kills. He has that execute, so that's obviously a huge factor, but it's not everything that you can use in a character or that you need in a match. And at some other aspects, he's just not quite as good, but his snowball potential is insane. His laning gets decent after a few levels or a bit of souls farmed. So overall, I will put him in A. Viscous, as much as I love the blob, is going to go into C, probably here. Maybe these two switch, I don't know. It's just a very cool character, but very difficult to pick up for beginners, I believe. Laning phase is alright once you get the faster projectile item. Before that, it's really annoying. Your Q, like your 1, is decent for poke and for clear, depending on what you need it for. And once you get your fist online, you can kind of use that, but it's also a very high skill floor thing to get going with that. So, yeah, I think the skill required to play this character well and to also utilize his ultimate well versus the impact that he usually has are just not justifying anything above C tier. On lower levels of play, more experienced Viscous players can perform better with him, but he is difficult to learn fully. Warden gets the S tier, probably somewhere around here-ish. I think Warden is just an extremely good character all around for beginners or in beginner games. Just gets very little challenge, I would say, from the opposition, whereas on higher levels people would just, for example, avoid him when he's ulting. And as such, I think for new players, he's just got massive snowball potential, and you will see a lot of strong Wardens quite often. His laning phase is definitely solid as well. He has decent objective push, even if you're going relatively heavily into health, or even into spirit, because his stuff scales with spirit in a way where even that remains somewhat effective, because I think it's the fire rate that's affected by spirit. So there's a lot of benefits that he has going for himself that I think overall just round him out very well and make him very useful. Wraith, very, very similar boat. Wraith, I'm very torn between S and A. Maybe we will just put her at the very end of S, just to keep it even level. I think Wraith is definitely a very potent character, just because of her insane 1v1 potential, but also very strong objective push, and just because of her high DPS, she's also good at team fighting, even though she's not technically built as a teamfight character. And her first ability being so easy to land means that she just has constant pressure in most lanes she's in. So I think Wraith gets the end of S tier here. She doesn't quite have the game-changing ults when it comes to like objectives and everything. Again, more single target focused, but overall definitely a character that you want to watch out for. Very, very close to Shiv here as well, but Shiv I think is a little bit harder to play effectively. You need to pay a little bit more attention. Can't just hold down left click quite as much as Wraith does. So you will see more worse performing Shivs compared to Wraith, I think. But again, very small margin, could easily be this, could easily be that. It's just somewhere between S and A, maybe like an A+ kind of level or something. Yamato, I think, is not a new player character. I think I'd put her like right ahead of Paradox. The first ability is such a core mechanic to her, and you kind of need to figure that out first, and need to learn the range, and need to get used to the charge up, and then Yeah, the first time you play, you're probably going to think she's a melee character, which she's really not. That's also very confusing because then she's being built spirit and you're not really going to melee much most of the time in most builds. It's just a lot of question marks for me in terms of character design that I think make her confusing to pick up and explain why she's usually not performing well on beginner levels of play. Her ultimate obviously is a nice get out of jail card with literally not being able to die for a bit, but then you also don't really have the same impact that characters, and your mobility ability rather, your hook attaches you to an enemy, so you can never use that to get out. So yeah, just a bit awkward, I would say. I haven't really experienced her enough yet, but again, on beginner levels of play, I never really ran into massive issues with her, except once when the player was very spirit focused and just running the one constantly, and that was basically it. So that's my Deadlock beginner levels of play tier list. Again, beginner level, heavy emphasis on that. This is not a high level of play. This is something that would significantly change if you go to higher levels of play. You'd have characters that immediately go down. You'd have characters that probably immediately go up. Some significant shifts that would move around if there was high level of play involved here. But this is just when you're starting out. I think this is who you're looking out for. This is what you're going to see overall. If you enjoyed this and you're interested in more info videos, then consider subscribing and clicking the bell. Feel free to check out the videos I have here. I've got a bunch of beginner tips already, as well as which beginner character you may want to choose starting out. And if you'd like to support me further, you can do so on Patreon. Thanks to all of my patrons who already do exactly that. And thank you for watching. Sloth, out.